Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to welcome you all to the Baker Institute to hear this discussion about the latest National Petroleum Council study, realizing the potential of North America's abundant natural gas and oil resources. I've been involved actually with various studies that the NPC has done since the '03 release of the natural gas report, balancing our natural gas future. And one thing is for sure, the world changes very quickly. When we think back to that study, shale gas was not something that was on very many people's radars at all. And I would have to say that the outlook that we presented therein was substantially different than most people would view the world today. So having said that, I guess the first thing I'd like to do is for those of you in the room who've worked on this particular study, if you could raise your hand or stand up just to be recognized, I think that would be wonderful. Virtue, please do. Yes. Thank you. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the MPC because a year ago, not this last summer, but the previous summer, they reached out to Rice University and myself in particular to find out if we had any good graduate students who could actually collect and compile data on natural gas resources. It was data that was collected through survey of different companies that are involved in the study and those that even weren't necessarily directly involved. But they did a really, really good job. I only see one of the graduate students who actually worked on it, Virtue Sigerly, who's sitting right here. They did a wonderful job, and NPC actually granted us a graduate fellowship as a result of that work, which is always a very, very nice thing to help further the educational endeavors of these students. Okay, with that, what I'm going to do is introduce the speakers in the order that they'll speak. And the way the program will work today is we'll actually hear from Chris Smith first. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oil and Natural Gas at the DOE. And he'll sort of give you the almost like user perspective, I think, in terms of the study, because they're actually, as you may or may not know, studies that the MPC does are usually done at the request of the Energy Secretary. So Secretary Chu will send a letter to the MPC and ask that this particular endeavor be undertaken, and then it is. And then after that, we'll take a few questions for Chris, and then once that's done, we're going to actually hear from Clay Bretches. He's the Vice President of E&P Services and Minerals at Anadarko. Then we'll hear from Andrew Slaughter, Business Environment Manager at Upstream Americas at Shell. And then Chris Conasante, Executive Director, Energy Investment Banking at JP Morgan Securities. And I think we're going to roll back to Clay to sort of wrap up. And then once those presentations are actually complete, that'll sort of give you the overview of the study. I think we'll have everybody up here at the table, and we'll ask everybody a few questions. So first, we're going to hear from Chris. Ask Chris any questions you have when he's done. Then we're going to hear from the MPC study participants, and we can ask questions at the end in a panel format. Okay, with that, Chris.
And so this actually isn't my slide deck, so I'm not going to be talking to slides. I'm just going to make some comments to kick things off. First of all, thanks to the Baker Institute for inviting me back here. We've been here on a couple occasions. We were here not too long ago when the Polish undersecretary was here talking about shale gas opportunities in Poland. So this is an institution, I think, that provides a lot of really useful forums to convene people and talk about important issues. I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Medlock when I was in the private sector not too long ago, so I appreciate the service that he's given in a lot of areas. So what I'd like to do before we get to the main part of the presentation, and which is going to consist of the study participants talking about the results, is talk a little bit about how the MPC process works, give you an idea of why the Secretary of Energy asked for this particular study, and a little bit of background on how we perceive the results of the study and how we're going to be using them going forward. So as Ken mentioned, the National Petroleum Council, it's a federal advisory committee. So it's a committee which exists for the express purpose of advising the Secretary of Energy on important energy issues. So what the Secretary of Energy usually will do is request that the MPC undertakes specific studies that will help the Department of Energy understand specific issues that are of great importance. So in this case, when Secretary Chu took over as Secretary of Energy, he asked the NPC to undertake 2 studies simultaneously, which is unusual. But the first study, which is the one that we're going to talk about today, is about the prudent development of North American oil and gas resources. And there's a second study, which the NPC is also undertaking right now, which is looking at the future transportation fuels. So together, what we're hoping is that those 2 studies will give us a different perspective on the challenges that face the nation and the things that we have to do within government and in cooperation with the private sector to ensure that we're prudently developing our North American resources and that we're doing the things that we need to do to move us to the clean energy economy of the future. So when you hear Secretary Chu talk about the clean energy economy of the future, we talk a lot about emerging technologies, about investments that we're making in everything from renewables to nuclear. But if you look at the time frame that Secretary Chu has put forth for the fuel study, which has the very unique requirement of advising us how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in the transportation sector by 2050. You'll note that the time frame for that study, it's not 2 years or 5 years, it's 40 years into the future, it's 2050. So inherent in that are a couple things. First of all, the challenges of moving to greater diversity in terms of fuel usage is great. Right now, about 98% of the miles that are traveled by American consumers are fueled by crude oil. And second, given that we do have a very long runway to our energy matrix of now and the energy matrix of the future, it's extremely important that we understand how to get the most out of our oil and gas resources. So oil and gas resources are going to be something that we focus on very specifically and explicitly in our policies and in our research. You'll see that the President back in March of this year issued a very specific challenge of reducing our imports by 1/3 over the next 10 years, over the next decade. And so there are going to be a couple things that are important in realizing that objective. First is understanding what we need to do offshore to ensure that we're producing the deep water and the ultra deep water resources efficiently and safely. And the second is some of the challenges that you'll hear us talk about today, which have to do with shale gas. Because when you look at how the resources are being replaced that we're using on a daily basis in the United States, how they're being replaced and replenished, they're coming from these 2 sources. One is the deep water, and the second is the unconventional oil and gas. So this study was commissioned about 2 years ago. There's been about 400 people, and I think that's kind of a conservative estimate of how many people have worked on the study. So it's been a tremendous undertaking. And a study of this specificity and of this detail, it takes a while to do. In the time that we've been working on this study, and I served as the government co-chair, Clay Bretches, who will be speaking after me, was the chair of the study. In the time that we've been working on this, we've actually seen a lot of changes. First has been, as we're all aware, the Deepwater Horizon, which occurred in the Gulf of Mexico, which was a disaster that I think I can candidly say that nobody saw coming, and that we saw that we weren't truly prepared for, but which had an outcome which certainly could have been worse, but certainly is pointing us towards the need to understand the risks and quantify the risks of producing in deep water and make sure that we're able to do that safely, because that, again, is one of the keys to ensuring that we meet our energy goals. The second big change that we've had, and this is a change that's been undergoing for the last many years, is the continued growth in the use of unconventional gas, of shale gas. And so the one thing that Ken mentioned in his entrance in the previous study, the Hard Truth study, that study was all about LNG, about how LNG was going to be produced overseas, imported to the U.S. and sold to American consumers as one of the keystones for ensuring our energy security. And now we're actually looking at taking LNG and going the opposite way. Just a couple weeks ago, Andrew and Ken and myself were testifying before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee on this very issue, on LNG exports. And so that's a change that's occurred actually as we've been doing the study. And so we're here evaluating the things that the country has to do and the policies that need to be put in place in order to prudently develop the resources. And as we're doing this study, we see that things are changing in real time. That kind of frames frames the two challenges I think we have on the two sides. So if we talked about deep water, we talked about shale gas. So the deep water challenge, you'll have prodigiously difficult technical challenges of producing in 1 mile and 2 miles of water, up to 10,000 feet of water. But you have a regulatory environment which is relatively stable. You've got a limited number of entities on the regulatory side which set the rules. DOI puts in place the standards which companies must meet. So you've got a fairly straightforward regulatory environment and a very, very difficult technical environment. If you contrast that with the shale gas, there is some complexity with shale gas development, and certainly companies have made big strides in being able to produce a difficult resource and doing it in a way that's safe and in a way that's economic. But you'll see that the regulatory challenges around shale gas are very difficult. So in place of having a single national framework for developing shale gas, you've got 32 different oil and gas producing states, each of which have a different set of regulations, a different set of standards, a different set of standards for inspection, different funding mechanisms for funding inspectors and for funding regulators. So the difference that you have on the regulatory side for shale gas makes that problem much more complex than you have in the offshore. So in the offshore, I think you've got some big technical challenges, a relatively straightforward regulatory environment. On the shale gas side, you've got some technical challenges, but you've got a truly difficult regulatory environment. One thing I'll mention to, I guess, kind of highlight that point. I was the designated federal official for the BP Deepwater Horizon Commission that was commissioned by the administration after the Macondo accident. And that commission had the difficult task of trying to figure out what went wrong with Macondo, while things were still going wrong. So, I mean, we did our first hearing down in Louisiana while that well was still belching hydrocarbons into the Gulf of Mexico. The capping stack had not yet been designed. We were still making plans for the relief well. There was still a lot of uncertainty about the mechanical integrity of that wellbore beneath the seafloor. So tremendous amounts of uncertainty, a lot of fear. People didn't really know what was going to happen next, and we had a big public hearing down in New Orleans in which people came up and talked about the concerns that they had. Our first step was to reach out to the public and get some feedback from the public about what they wanted to see occur. I contrast that with the first public hearing that we had in Pennsylvania for a second federal advisory committee that was created by the administration. This one was the Secretary of Energy's advisory board on natural gas. And this was a group that was looking at the issues around shale gas and hydraulic fracturing, community impact, et cetera. So we had a similar public hearing in Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, in which we were in a junior college auditorium. And if I compare the level of concern, the mood, the vitriol in the crowd of hearing A, in which there was an ongoing disaster occurring in the Gulf of Mexico, versus the hearing that we did in Pennsylvania, I'd say that the spirit of the audience and the level of concern in the shale gas hearing was much higher. Certainly, this is an issue that people are truly concerned about, and partially because we're producing these resources right where people live, where they work, where they worship, where they go to school. And so this is a public issue that people are concerned about. And it's one that we have to get right, because if we're going to meet our goals in terms of diversifying our energy matrix, of creating options that make us less reliant on oil, of giving consumers more choices, of reducing the prices that Americans pay, it's clear that natural gas is something that we know how to do. It's a resource that we have here in the United States. It's a resource we can produce that would create jobs here in the United States, that would create economic opportunity, that would improve our balance of payments. But it's something that we definitely have to do in a way that responds to concerns that communities have. So part of the mandate that we've gotten from our secretary is to ensure that we're making our plans for the future, and as we are putting forth the research that we do at the Department of Energy, we're primarily a technical organization. We look at research and development that has to do with everything from commercializing new sources of energy all the way to quantifying the risks of our current energy portfolio. That we have to be working with industry to make sure that not only are we understanding the innovations that industry is putting out on a real-time basis, because this isn't a static question. It doesn't stop and you understand the equation and then you're finished. It's something that continues to move on. And so Secretary Chu has instructed us to make sure that we're working very closely with industry to make sure that we understand the innovations that are coming forward, that we are leveraging the skills and the capabilities and the talents that come from the research that industry is putting into these equations or into these questions, and that we're collaboratively working to make sure that we're achieving these objectives. So that's something that's really important for us, in that there's going to be literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that go into these into developing our shale gas resources, and offshore. You'll observe that industry will spend $100 million on a single ultra deep water well. Industry will spend $4 or $5 billion on a single ultra deep water development, and that investments of those size attract a lot of technical talent, and that's talent that we need to be working with collaboratively within the Department of Energy. So a couple of specific things that I'll mention, then I'll hand it over see if there are any questions before we go to the MPC panel. First is, as you look at the results that we got out of this study, you'll see a lot of practical steps, I think, that move us in the right direction. Practical steps in terms of recommendations around the best ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, practical steps around what are the best ways to ensure that the right best practices are being used across the board to ensure that we're producing these resources in a way that's safe, and a lot of practical advice around what is truly the potential of the industry to displace imports, to create jobs, to improve our balance of trade, to do a lot of good things for American consumers and for the American economy. So you'll see some practical steps which we'll endeavor to act upon and make sure that we're working closely with industry. A second step which we're taking within Washington is to make sure that as we do research within the Department of Energy to quantify the risks of exploration production activities and help support the state regulators who have the day in and day out mission of regulating these activities, that we're closely coordinating with the Environmental Protection Agency, and that we're closely coordinating with USGS and Department of Interior. So you've got various entities within Washington, D.C. that have a research mission, that have a research mandate. These various entities work often on the same issues, from hydraulic fracturing to surface impacts to deep water risks. But you'll see that USGS and DOI and DOE and EPA do have very specific core competencies. We have specific research backgrounds, we have specific experiences, and we bring different things to the table. So one thing that we'll hope that the industry will see and the public will see is that going forward, as we make plans to implement a sustainable ongoing research program, that you'll see these three entities working together and in concert. And we're going to endeavor to make sure that there's a single clear message coming out in terms of what are our research priorities and how are we working together with industry to make sure that we're producing these resources in a way that's safe and sustainable. So that's something that's going on an ongoing basis. Just to close, I'll mention that this study that you're about to hear about was a 2-year effort. A tremendous amount of effort, a lot of subject matter expertise that went into the study. And as we were presenting this to Secretary Chu, I think we're fortunate to have a Nobel Prize winning scientist running the Department of Energy, and he's got a high standard for the intellectual quality that he expects to see out of studies, right? So the fact that he reviewed the study, he understood it, he took in the recommendations, and that he was complimentary of the efforts that the studies team leadership have put forward. I think have increased the probability that the results of the study will lead to actual actions that are taken by the federal government, by the administration, by the Department of Energy. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that the group might have.
How did you decide 400 people? That was it a challenge to bring in the 400 people together and make this study?
Yeah, that's something that I'll actually let the study group talk a little bit about. But certainly, as the study was commissioned, one thing that was very clear to us is that the National Petroleum Council is an entity, an organization. It does have a lot of member buy-in. It's got a history of contributing to these studies, because I think the NPC recognizes that by putting this type of effort into the study and the type of intellectual rigor that comes up with good recommendations, that you lead to a good product that then is actionable. Right? So I'd say that as the user of the study, as the recipient of the study, we've seen the right people working on it. I've been consistently impressed with the number of hours, and at the end of the day, the investment that companies have made into the study, because you've got people who normally are working, making money for their companies, who are spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C., kind of thinking through and wrestling through these difficult issues. One other thing I'll mention about the makeup of the study, it wasn't just companies, it wasn't just the oil and gas majors. We made a real effort to make sure that we diversified the participation of this study. So we had people that came in from the end users, we had banks and consultants, but we also had non-governmental organizations. We had environmentalist organizations, we had academia who was participating. So we had a group of participants in the study in this particular study that I think was broader functionally and more representative, I believe, of the challenges that we have to solve than we've had in any other NPC study. So I think as the recipient of the study, we're happy with the folks who worked on it.
Did the NPC this time around do anything different that would make this study better, in that the 1999 NPC study was the world has plenty of, and the U.S. has plenty of natural gas, goes up from $2 to $3, we're awash in natural gas. Yeah. 4 years later, oh my gosh, hard truths, we're going to be importing massive amounts of LNG, and FERC needs to approve every LNG terminal in sight. And now comes this, a couple of years later. So was the procedure different, or the people different, or something different that is worth, I'm a professor, right. It was worth my students reading this one?
All right. Well, I'll actually come up here and I'll ask you the same question after you hear the results and see what you think. But, you raise a key question. I mean, one of, as you're reading the hard truths and reading the study before that, and you realize you had a bunch of smart people working on all those studies. I mean, I was working in industry when the plan was to bring all the LNG in the world to the U.S. because that was the plan for the future. And that wasn't just a study. I mean, that was companies spending tens of billions of dollars. I mean, lots of money. So, when you got a bunch of smart people in the room who've got all the right curves and the right degrees and the right experiences, it's easy to have this feeling of hubris where you understand what's going to happen next. And but I think that looking through the history of the studies, it gives you a little bit of humility about being able to shine your crystal ball and see exactly what's going to happen next. So that was a discussion we had many times as we're going through these discussions about how do you ensure that you know what you know, but you also have some awareness of what you don't know. So that was certainly one of the thoughts that was in our mind, and as we broadened the types of people that we had involved in the study, that was an attempt to address that very question. But it's always something that you wrestle with.
You mentioned about your hearings in Pennsylvania, right, and compared it with Macondo Valley. Can you tell me a couple of examples of how did you handle them? Were you successful in convincing them that it is safe?
So, in these hearings,
we keep on hearing even now that there is a lot of resistance in Marcellus in New York.
Yeah. So, our job as the Department of Energy is not to convince people that one way or the other, right? Our job is to listen to communities, understand concerns that communities have, and then commission the right type of science, the right type of studies that quantifies the risks that people are concerned about, and then communicate the results back to the community. So in the particular hearing that I spoke about, our job was to listen, and I was there with the Secretary of Energy's advisory board that was headed by John Deutsch, who was brought in by the administration to lead that effort. So that was a listening exercise, right? And a lot of the debate was crosswise between this side of the room and that side of the room. So that was interesting to watch. I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but that might have been the last
Do you have
question.
any more questions, Chris? Okay, if not, thanks, Chris.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Ken, for hosting this today. It's a real pleasure for us to be here. I want to thank my colleagues, Andrew Slaughter and Chris Conoscenti, for joining me today. I think this will be a deeper dive than what many of you have heard. I presented this presentation and Chris joined me in Washington about a month and a half ago to the USAE, and so some of you may have seen it then. But this is a bit of a deeper dive, and I think having the subject matter experts here, Andrew and Chris, today will make this a better presentation altogether. I also want to thank Chris not only for being my government co-chair, but also for serving on the Secretary's Energy Advisory Board and the Deepwater Spill Commission. Just a lot of people don't realize how much work is done in Washington and the passion that the folks that are up there representing us have for our industry. And I just want to thank Chris for going up from industry and doing all the work that you have done. Your experience really did help this study a great deal. Last thing I'd like to point out, just an administrative item, the study material that you're about to see right now, you can access all of this information on npc.org. So if you're interested in taking a look at the final report, the report was actually delivered to the Department of Energy in September of this year. The executive summary and all of the supporting chapters are on npc.org. A fully published version of the executive summary will be out this month, and the chapters should follow in January of 2012. Okay, with that, just a brief review of the National Petroleum Council. Some of you are familiar, some of you are not, but I should just open up by saying that the NPC is not an advocacy organization. It is a group that's sole existence is to advise the federal government on matters related to energy. And it is comprised certainly of people from the oil and gas industry, but it also has end users, people from academia, experts from various fields, including, as Chris said earlier, from the non-government organization areas, as well as Native American groups. It is well balanced, and it has a broad level of support in both the government as well as the industry, and the credibility, because of its diversification, is unmatched. Now, when we were asked to perform this study by the Secretary of Energy in September of 2009, he asked that we assess 5 key areas. First of all, he wanted us to assess the North American resource base, and I heard a question earlier about what's different about this study from the 99 study and the 2007 study, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But to reassess this North American resource base, to describe the operating practices and technologies that will be used to minimize environmental impacts and in expanding accessible resources. So how can we make this prize bigger? To assess supply and demand through 2035 with views to 2050, and identify emission reductions stemming from increased use of natural gas. And then lastly, to advise on policy options that will allow prudent development consistent with the objectives of environmental protection, economic prosperity, and energy security. Now, this next slide is probably one of the most important slides in my view when you start talking about trying to establish credibility for the NPC. You can see here that over 50% of the participants in this study, and it was a 400-member study plus, and again, that was a conservative number. And thank you for those of you who participated in this room, and thank the graduate students for joining us and helping out with the survey material that went out a couple of years ago. But over 50% of the participants were outside of the industry. And I think that's what makes this study so incredible. And that diversity and the differences in opinions and ideas that came forth were absolutely incredible. And we tried to capture those differences and highlight those differences throughout the study. The study approach that we took was a study of studies, and this is very similar to what was done in the hard truth study. When we talk about a study of studies, we did not try to go through modeling efforts. We did not try to give you deterministic forecasting. What we tried to produce was a range of outcomes. And again, going back to the question earlier about why is this study believable, or more so than previous studies, is it worthwhile? I believe it is, and the reason for that is because we looked at so many studies and work that had already been done, over 700, probably, and that's conservative, different studies on different areas that are impacted by this particular study. And what we looked for were ranges of outcomes, fairways, if you will, and I've been told not to use that analogy because not everybody plays golf. But what we tried to use was the minimum and the maximum. So a lot of what you'll see today is you will see ranges. You won't see spot-on deterministic forecasting. Okay, so before we go into the details of the study, and Andrew's going to lead us off, I just want to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what you'll hear because we're going to go into some depth. So I just want to give you some of the highlights. First of all, that there's a tremendous amount of natural gas and oil resources. The estimates of the resource base have increased dramatically in the past 4 years since the hard truth study came out in 2007. So again, this is incredible, and it all has to do with the application of technology. Now, the resource base didn't grow per se. The accessible resources did grow, and that's because of the use of technology. There's enough natural gas to meet even our highest cases of demand, and we went out there and again trying to find those fairways and those ranges. What would be the highest range of demand that you could come up with, and we can still meet those with the resource base that we have for decades to come. There are big needle movers with regard to greenhouse gas reductions. We have some significant reductions that we'll talk about in just a bit. And there are material economic benefits to our nation as well, to include millions of high-paying jobs and enormous tax and royalty benefits to the federal, state, and local governments. But the only way that we can realize these benefits is if we develop the resources prudently. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about towards the end of the presentation. We'll whet your appetite with how big this resource base really is, what great things can come of it, but how you have to get there is the key, and that comes through prudent development. So I will turn it over now to Andrew Slaughter, who's going to lead us through the supply and demand phase. We're going to go through 5 phases. Pardon me just a minute, Andrew. We'll go through supply, hit on demand, macroeconomics. We'll talk about emission reductions opportunities. Then we'll get into the operations and the environment piece, that prudent development piece, and then we'll go into our question and answer session. So, Andrew.
Thanks, Clay. I'm going to talk first about the supply side and then segue into the demand side. On the supply side of this study, first of all, I want to give credit to the very, very deep expertise which I was able to tap and bring into this process. I had about 100 very experienced, very knowledgeable industry professionals working on the supply side of the study with several thousand man-years of experience cumulatively in the various areas of resource assessment and hydrocarbon development potential and opportunity. So I was very privileged to work on with such a distinguished group of people. Now, this is the map you just saw, which Clay just showed. I'm going to talk about natural gas for the first few minutes and then talk about oil. The reason that we're in a different world from 1999 and 2007, which Jacqueline was great to remind us of, is that there really is a new accessible resource in this continental arena. The shale gas revolution has fundamentally transformed the accessible resource. And it's not only through technical benefits in a narrow space. This is a widely diversified resource geographically, as you can see on the map. So this has augmented what we already had as significant resources in offshore and in conventional gas. and has become the basis for several decades or more of producible natural gas in North America. But this comes with choices. What we're going to talk about is the choices of development. The how and the how much depend on choices of investment strategy, but also choices in policy and regulation. And I think this is what we wanted to lay out to the administration and to the public opinion and to the users of this study. Now, we're of course not starting from zero. The great thing is in natural gas particularly, we're starting with a tremendous platform for development. The US has overtaken Russia already as the leading natural gas producer in the world. If you add Canada to that, and it is an integrated market, we're significantly in the lead in terms of natural gas production. But it's not just supply numbers. This is based on this arena being an area for technology development, for supply chain development, and for unconventional gas in all its manifestations. First coal bed methane, then tight gas, and then of course shale gas. And before that, we developed in this arena offshore technology first. So we have an experience base, we have a technology base, we have a deployment base, which is unparalleled in terms of global gas. And I think this arena, this North American arena, is extremely fortunate to have that platform to build on. If you look at the resource assessments, and this goes back again to the question of what has changed. 10 years or so ago, earlier in the decade, around the 1999 to 2005, resource assessments from all the organizations that tended to do this were in the 1,000 to 1,400 TCF range. That sounds like a lot of gas, but we were producing a lot of gas, and some of that was quite expensive. When the shale gas players started to emerge in the middle of the decade, people started to look at more things, to unlock more plays, to apply technology in different areas. And the more recent resource assessments, I can't make this pointer work, but to the right-hand side of this chart, they're 2 to 3 times what they were earlier in the decade. So this gives tremendous running room for more supply. These are technically producible resources. It's not gas in place. And as we find out more about these plays, as we work more in the various areas, we tend to find out more, and these numbers tend to grow. So the range is large, but tends to begin to converge on the higher part of that range. Now, this is a complicated slide, but it shows the scope of what we can do in terms of long-term development of natural gas. The horizontal axis is recoverable resource in trillion cubic feet. The vertical axis is the wellhead development cost. That box is the cumulative demand from 2010 to 2035. The left-hand side of the box is the low demand case. The right-hand side of the box is the high demand case. So it shows that whatever demand path we think is likely to play out over the next 20 years, there is a considerable resource beyond that in time. Many decades of moderate cost natural gas resource past 2035, going into mid-century and beyond. And the different resource curves there are from the MIT natural gas study, which was corroborated by many other studies that we've seen, and shows different categorizations of the resource base and the development path, but all are very, very positive for the potential of natural gas development over many decades to come. If we look at the sources of these, clearly onshore gas, conventional and unconventional gas to 2035 is going to be the biggest component. That it will continue to grow. In this particular slide, the left-hand axis is annual production. It's not cumulative, but it shows annual production has the capacity to grow at least over the next 25 years and probably beyond.
And that's a step change, a sea change from what the industry was thinking 5 years ago, 8 years ago, when we had this world where we thought we were going to have to import LNG to make up our supply long term. That has completely changed. The offshore remains very significant and will be even more significant if we're able to work offshore the Atlantic and offshore the Pacific. And coming up towards the end of the period, we have natural gas hydrates, methane hydrates in there. Methane hydrates are but present in very large quantities, both in the Gulf of Mexico and offshore in the Arctic regions. They are not included in any of the recoverable resource assessments that you have seen. So this is additional to the very large numbers you saw a couple of minutes ago. Working with these, we think there is a potential pathway for economic development in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe if the pre-commercial work on production technologies and cost reduction is done. So to bring these into the mix, you have to have a sustained technical pathway from now on, but they could be very significant and take natural gas as a base load of supply beyond 2050 and into the next century. So when we talk of natural gas being a bridge fuel, we can build bridges that last a very long time indeed. Now turning to oil, the contrast between natural gas and oil was that most people that we talked to, both in industry and academics and in government, were waking up, kind of starting to know about the natural gas transformation. Oil was more surprising to some people. We have abundant oil resources in North America. Like gas, there are choices available in development, how we do it and how much we do it. But the world-class basins we have now, for example, the Gulf of Mexico and the Alberta oil sands, are already very big producers and provide a great platform for future development. And again, like gas, we are right up there in North America with Saudi Arabia and Russia. And you tend to think of Saudi Arabia and Russia as the giants of oil production globally. Not many people in this continent realize that we're up there as a producer with US and Canada together. We think of the US as an oil importer, but in fact, although we are an oil importer, our production base and our technology base and our supply chain base is a very, very robust platform going forward. And so if you look how this plays out potentially out to 2035, we compare the range of outlooks for 2035 on the right-hand side with supply in 2010, or the production from North America in 2010 on the left-hand side. We've highlighted the unconventional components of growth, the oil sands, the emerging tight oil plays. Those are the main sources of growth and new offshore. But there's also very significant growth potential in conventional oil plays as well, offshore, economically driven onshore plays, and of course NGLs, which come along with the expansion of gas production. So here you see very clearly a set of choices where if these things work well and are allowed to work well in terms of access, in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of operating regulation, there's a world out there where this could get to 20 to 25 million barrels a day in the next 25 years. If policy choices and regulatory choices and investment choices do not support that, then of course we get to the world in that middle bar there, where stagnation and decline continues in liquids production in North America, and import needs actually increase. So it's about choices, as with gas, choices of regulation, choices of policy, and choices of access. This is not couched as an energy independent story. That totally depends on what happens on the demand side. But I think the economic benefits and the balance of trade benefits to this right-hand side story, the more aggressive, the more high potential development, should be very clear to everybody. So we think of both natural gas and oil, North American hydrocarbons in portfolio terms, and you know your financial portfolios benefit from diversification and options. The same is true for hydrocarbons. So we have a portfolio which is very, very rich in terms of geographical diversity, in terms of technology intensity, and in terms of resource type, and in terms of time to develop. In the near term, we have these large-scale, currently commercial developments in the Gulf of Mexico and the oil sands, and even onshore gas, clearly, but onshore oil is still quite significant. So the trick is to have policies, regulations, and investment regimes which sustain these very large contributors to the hydrocarbon mix right now. In the medium and long term, we're looking at adding new areas, new offshore areas, critically new exploration in the Arctic, which is very high potential, both oil and gas, and maintaining, sustaining growth in the currently producing areas. And in the very long term, we have these very high potential but pre-commercial resources in things like shale oil, Colorado shale oil, and methane hydrates, where although they're pre-commercial today, it needs some sustained attention in terms of technology development and innovation to bring them into the mix in the next 20 to 30 years. So how can policy help? There are various areas. Appropriate leasing and royalty frameworks, I think, are very important. We tend to think in international terms that North America is relatively attractive compared to other regimes. But even so, there are improvements that can be made. A lease term offshore the Arctic, in Alaska particularly, is governed by the same regime as a Gulf of Mexico lease. And clearly, your drilling window in the Arctic is far reduced from what it is in the Gulf of Mexico. It's something like 100 days a year if you're lucky versus 365 days in the Gulf of Mexico because of the ice conditions. So a better tailoring of lease terms to local conditions would certainly aid development. And the same is true with royalty frameworks, community participation in the economic benefits of development at the same time. Long-term technology partnerships, and here I'm talking particularly about pre-commercial developments, things like methane hydrates and oil shale. The industry tends to put those as a lower priority when we have so many commercial opportunities in the near term. But to make the long term happen, we have to work with academia and government to sustain those technology efforts. Energy data and analysis capabilities for government and industry. It's very important that we talk the same language here. We have the same base of understanding of the components of the market, what the resource size is, and what the development pathways look like. We need the assessment agencies to look not only at existing areas, but to look at new areas and new technology impacts on resources. If we know more or less the size of what we're going for, then that focuses attention on how we develop it and over what time frame. And finally, infrastructure. Infrastructure is kind of the orphan child of hydrocarbon development, but it's the essential link which brings hydrocarbons from the wellhead to the market. And so we have a permitting regime in natural gas, which generally works through FERC. It's generally effective. We built out a lot of natural gas pipelines with new areas over the last couple of years. We need to make sure those permitting regimes continue to be effective. I'm going to turn to demand now, and I just want to pay credit and recognize to Ken Yeasting and Jim Austin of IHS Sierra, who led the NPC demand group. They couldn't be here today, but I'm going to try and give you the flavor of what we said about natural gas demand. The focus here was on natural gas rather than oil, purely because the oil demand is so dependent on the transportation sector, and that's the subject of the parallel NPC study. So looking at gas demand in a little more detail, these are snapshots of outlooks, both public sector outlooks and outlooks from the surveys we made on a proprietary nature to companies and participants in this sector. And the biggest variation here is in the power sector. That is very key to establishing what is the trajectory of natural gas demand. And that depends on economic assumptions, but it more critically depends on what you assume about regulation in the power sector, both non-GHG regulation, and eventually do you assume something about carbon regulation. And so that's the very big variable in US natural gas demand. In Canada, it's a little different. Here you see the biggest variation is in industrial demand, and industrial demand in Canada, as you may know, is very clearly driven by what happens in the oil sands. And so we had our unconventional oil team work hand in hand with the demand side to give various outlooks for oil sands development and how that translates into a range of natural gas demand of natural gas demand in Canada. So we did manage to integrate these things in the study. And again, compared to 2010 on the left, the range of outcomes for supply and demand is shown on the right. So we have high demand, high supply, low demand, low supply. In the middle, that's in one bar. The light blue is the low supply. The top of the dark blue is the high supply. And so when you stress test demand, when you take the highest projections that we could find on conventional demand for natural gas, and you add in reasonable allowances for gas penetration into transportation and gas exports, then you get to something around 130 BCF a day by 2035. The supply side analysis showed that that can be supplied at still remaining at moderate cost. However, if supply development is constrained either through access conditions, through regulation, technology-driven regulation or regional regulation, then you could go back to the situation which we thought we were in 5 years ago, when domestic supply doesn't keep up with demand growth, even in the low demand case. And in that case, we're back to where we thought we were, importing LNG in large scale to balance the market. Now, we have the infrastructure to do that, clearly, but the balance of trade and the economic implications are rather more negative. The electric power sector is the key sector, as I mentioned, in demand growth. This shows the EIA Annual Energy Outlook comparison of levelized cost for new investment in power generation. It's corroborated by other studies. And what this shows is that natural gas combined cycle and natural gas-fired generation on an economic basis is more favorable than pretty much everything else except hydro. And so you would expect on an economic basis that a large part of new generation investment choices will go to natural gas. And that's a very key part, as you'll hear, of how natural gas demand can contribute to lowering the trajectory of carbon emissions. Now, as natural gas in power becomes more important as a part of the power sector, issues of harmonization of the gas and power markets become more critical from the point of view of reliability, particularly, and making the system work efficiently. This is manifested in terms of things like scheduling, the day-ahead scheduling for gas versus the hour-ahead scheduling for power dispatch. It means day-to-day utilities have to take an exposure risk on how much gas do they buy, how much power do they commit to the grid from their units. And we think it would be of great benefit to harmonize these markets as they become more interdependent. If you look at the industrial sector, this chart compares two outlooks from the EIA and shows the 2010 reference case versus the 2011 reference case, and it shows how we are shifting in our expectation of how industry can use natural gas. The perception of moderate price natural gas in the long term is contributing to the beginnings of an industrial renaissance in the US. We're having announcements of new ethylene crackers on the Gulf Coast, in the Marcellus. We're getting demothballing and reopening of ammonia plants. We're getting the steel industry looking again at natural gas and reopening plants in the Northeast. And so the outlook for natural gas in industry is much better, much more robust than it was several years ago. And again, with all the spin-off benefits in terms of jobs, economic value added, and export activity in manufactured goods. Coming to the end of the demand chapter, we made some recommendations. Efficiency is a key part of that. We highlighted efficiency in the Hard Truth study as being the number one cornerstone of energy policy. It makes sense in any scenario. This study reconfirmed that. Energy efficiency is absolutely beneficial to energy security, to reduction in emissions, and to maintaining and improving consumer amenity in all sectors. So a lot of what you see on the screen here is related to embedding energy efficiency in the systems. Full fuel cycle analysis from wellhead to appliance or use, so that customers, consumers can readily compare the fuel profile and or the emissions profile of a particular use. Very important. Building codes, removing disincentives to combined heat and power, which is really, there's a lot of running room in combined heat and power if we can get that deployed more widely, and allowing utilities to benefit from promotion of energy efficiency. Now they have a disincentive. Then when we have some recommendations in terms of markets, utilities need to be able to integrate price risk management better in their gas purchasing strategies. Right now they're very risk averse, and probably rightly so, and the utility commissioners are very risk averse. We think there's a case for integrating that into strategy better. Harmonization of gas and power, I've just mentioned that. I think that improves reliability and efficiency of the system. And then I want to mention CCS, which is up there in the first point. We think of CCS, or many people think of CCS as a means of allowing coal generation to remain and increase as baseload generations. As gas gets a larger share of the generation mix, development of CCS needs to be considered in a fuel-neutral way. And if we need very deep carbon reductions by mid-century, then CCS on gas-fired generation is going to be absolutely critical, as well as coal-fired generation. So a fuel-neutral approach to CCS research, development, and deployment is something that we think would be very beneficial for policy, from a policy perspective. I'll be happy to take questions at the end, and I'm sure there's many things that I haven't gone into in sufficient detail, but let's hear from Chris Conoscenti about the macroeconomic story on all this.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Before I dive into the industry-specific data and analysis, I wanted to frame the discussion about the current economic conditions. The good news is that GDP is growing, payrolls are expanding, and unemployment is falling. The bad news is that none of this is happening fast enough. And these trends, these positive trends I just mentioned, have been supported with unprecedented levels of public debt. In fact, the nation's debt now equals its GDP. There's almost no hope to reduce the absolute amount of public debt. So we need policies that are conducive to the private sector's growth and prosperity for all working Americans. So with that backdrop, I'll get into a few industry-specific elements of that we touched on in the study. The macroeconomic group really focused its efforts on domestic employment, labor income, GDP, and government revenues derived from the sector. In May of this year, Price Waterhouse published an update to its 2009 study of the macroeconomic impacts of the oil and gas sector on the domestic economy. This was the most comprehensive national study we reviewed. According to this study, the industry directly employs 2.2 million Americans. Even if you exclude gas station workers from that total, the number is still quite impressive at 1.3 million Americans. Once we include jobs needed to support the activities of oil and gas companies and their employees, the total number of jobs supported by the industry exceeds 9 million. None of these employment estimates include jobs that have been added in recent years in the petrochemical industry that Andrew mentioned as a result of our abundant domestic natural gas resources. Importantly, the jobs that are focused on domestic oil and gas extraction, for the most part, need to be performed domestically. These are American jobs, and these are good-paying jobs. As you can see from the graph on this page, oil and gas extraction jobs, which are the last bar on the page, pay on average 74% above the national average wage. In fact, excluding gas station jobs, every category of employment in the oil and gas industry pays above the national average. In addition to the natural gas and oil industry's important role in GDP, employment, and labor income contributions, the industry is a significant source of government revenue. The graph on this slide shows that the oil and gas industry is the third largest payer of federal corporate income taxes. However, federal corporate income taxes are only a small fraction of the total federal, state, and local revenues generated by the industry. Once royalties on government lands, severance, sales, property and use, payroll, and excise taxes, which are ultimately borne by consumers, are counted, the industry generates over $250 billion in government revenue every year. In the federal budget debate, the President and some in Congress have proposed eliminating the oil and gas industry's ability to use 8 specific tax deductions and 1 R&D program. According to the President's budget, these eliminations would save taxpayers a total of $3.5 billion in 2012. Virtually every energy source realizes some form of government financial support, either in the form of direct subsidies, loan supports and guarantees, and tax deductions. The table on this page illustrates that on a $1 per MMBTU basis, the tax benefits to the natural gas and oil industry are negligible compared to other energy sources. While talk of eliminating tax benefits to the natural gas and oil industry make for good political sound bites, it overlooks a certain reality. On average, natural gas and oil companies reinvest their cash flow back into the ground. So they invest in additional drilling activity, which creates jobs, adds to GDP, adds to domestic production, and in the case of oil, it reduces the amount of dollars that have to flow overseas for the import of oil. We conducted a series of examinations on various size companies, and the story was the same across all size companies. So just for simplicity on the slide, we chose mid-cap E&P companies. So what you see here is a series of graphs for each year. So 2005 through 2010, the operating cash flow the companies generated in that year on average, the capital they spent that year on average, and the resulting cash flow deficit. So let's pick the bars on the right side of the page in 2010. The blue bar, you can see the companies generated from operating cash flow $600 million on average. They spent over $700 million on average, which implies that they were deficit spending about $100 million per year. So the conclusion here really is that dollars not spent on taxes are reinvested into the ground. A quick note on volatility. As the macroeconomics subgroup assessed the topic of commodity price volatility, it quickly became apparent that there is widespread misuse of the term volatility. Conventional volatility is actually a byproduct of healthy functioning markets, one that allows buyers and sellers to respond to signals from the market around supply and demand. The more problematic alternate definition of volatility refers to the accuracy or inaccuracy of price expectations of market participants. The power producer that builds a natural gas-fired generation plant with a gas price expectation that later turns out to be inaccurate. The good news is that there are mitigants for the second form of volatility, and we are experiencing a very powerful one right now in the form of expanded unconventional natural gas resource development. As the elasticity of supply increases, for example, by expanded production capacity, the market can respond to greater demand with less upward pressure on prices. And now turning to the topic of the workforce in the oil and gas industry. The NPC Hard Truth study made mention of the impending retirement of baby boomers. That wave of retirement has already begun. In 1997, only 26% of SPE members were age 50 or older. In 2010, that number jumped to 45%. That pattern is not unique to the private sector. 62% of petroleum engineers working for the U.S. government are age 50 or older. The same goes for geoscientists. Baby boomers started turning 65 this year, and at many companies, the eligible age for retirement is younger than 65. Compounding this demographic shift is the insufficient number of university and postgraduate students coming through the system to fill the gap of retiring technical professionals. The great crew change is underway, and the government and the private sector need to address this challenge. The good news is that enrollment has increased in the petroleum engineering field, as illustrated by the graph on this slide, and to a lesser degree in the geosciences. Unfortunately, the good news is a little too late. Even with the increasing population of students in these disciplines, there is still a wide experience gap between a retiring technical professional with 30 years of experience and a new hire directly from academia. The workforce issue is not just a private sector problem, as I mentioned. Federal and state governments that oversee the activities of oil and gas companies need technical professionals to adequately perform their oversight and regulatory roles. Given these challenges, the NPC recommends that both the federal government and natural gas and oil companies contribute to the solution. The federal government has the ability to direct research grants to fields that lead to areas of interest for careers in the oil and gas industry. Also, over 25% of the students enrolled in petroleum engineering and the geosciences are not U.S. nationals. The federal government could modify regulations that would allow more of these students to eventually work in the U.S. Lastly, K-12 education, particularly math and science education at those levels, provides the foundation necessary to pursue higher education that could lead to careers as technical professionals in the industry. The recent publication of Rising Above the Gathering Storm by the National Academy of Sciences highlighted the point that the amount of improvement the U.S. needs to make in its math and science education at the K-12 levels. Oil and gas companies will need to take the lead with additional recruiting efforts and training opportunities for undergraduate students and graduate students. The combined efforts of the federal government and industry participants can make a significant impact in the great crew change that is underway. With that, I'll turn it back over to Clay.
Thank you, Chris. And before I get started, I want to recognize Fiji George with El Paso for his work and his leadership on this next topic, which is emission reductions. And when we talk about emission reductions, we're not only talking about greenhouse gas emissions, but we're also talking about SOx, NOx, and mercury specifically. I also want to recognize Kyle Sawyer, who's joining us today from El Paso, who led a report writing subgroup. Kyle, thanks for joining us today. If you take a look at this slide and you look at the work within the chapter itself is very technical with regard to greenhouse gas emission reductions as requested by Secretary Chu. And I want to remind everyone that the specific question from Secretary Chu was, how can natural gas reduce emissions? So we didn't go down a lot of different pathways with regard to renewables, it's nuclear, etc. We really focused on natural gas. So when you see the work that I'm about to show you and when you see the work within the chapter itself, remember, we were going specifically with a request from Secretary Chu. But if you take a look at the reduction pathways, and these are formalized and explained in depth in the chapter itself, coal displacement is one of the key reduction pathways with regard to power generation. That's where we see one of the biggest reducers of emissions overall. Natural gas end-use technologies can also reduce emissions, and I'll show you that in just a minute, but only 12% of the 2005 baseline. And I'll just point to the graph itself. What we measured for this study, we used the 2005 emissions for our baseline, And you can see the line that's increasing over time through 2050 from 2005. Those are the emission projections based on the EIA's AEO 2010 and 2011 projections. But you can see increases in emissions given the status quo through 2050 unabated. And in order for us to reduce those emissions, we will have to do things again, such as coal displacement with use of natural gas in-use technologies, enforcement of the EPA non-greenhouse gas regulations. When we talk about that, those are actually EPA regulations that have to do with emissions that are not related to greenhouse gases. However, enforcement of those regulations that are on the books but unenforced will actually have the benefit of reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then lastly, a price on carbon, and I'm going to speak to that at the end of this when we go through the recommendations, because there are many who believe that the National Petroleum Council actually recommended a price on carbon, which was not indeed the case. It was just, we simply looked at it and basically said that it was an efficient and effective mechanism for reducing greenhouse gases. So it's a subtlety, but I just want to point that out. With regard to coal, one of the key benefits of natural gas is that it has an emission profile with regard to CO2 of 50 to 60% less than coal. This is significant when we start talking about the target-rich opportunity of coal-fired plants. As many of you know, over 32% of the coal plants in this country are 40 years old or older. 14% of these coal-fired plants are 50 years or older. So there are a lot of inefficient coal-fired plants out there. When replaced with natural gas-fired plants, especially high-efficiency units, you end up with a much lower CO2 and other emission profile. It reduces SOx, it reduces NOx, and of course there's no mercury emissions that coincide with natural gas-fired power plants. Retirement decisions are much easier in this price environment. When you take a look at coal versus natural gas in past years, it was difficult to make such a decision to retire coal plants because of the significant price disparity between coal and natural gas. With the abundance of natural gas that you see now, and if you go pointing back to Andrew's slide earlier about what types of wellhead development costs we'll be seeing in years to come through 2035, which is quite reasonable. Again, it makes this type of a decision much less painful. This is just a range of outcomes, and again, going back to what I said earlier, it was a study of studies. So we looked at varying technologies, gas end-use technologies that could reduce emissions. And you can see here that we see a range from approximately 120 million tons of CO2 per year to as much as 860 million tons per year. It really depends upon the assumptions. And because we did look at so many studies, what we want to show here is there's a pretty wide disparity about what is out there. But even if you take the highest range, the 860 million tons of CO2 reduction per year with gas end-use technologies as we know them, that's still only 12% of the CO2 emitted in 2005. So you just can't get a deep enough cut even with the technologies, and pretty expensive technologies at that. So then we get into our recommendations, and first of all, we wanted to state that we wanted to provide some regulatory certainty to the power sector on the enforcement of EPA non-greenhouse gas regulations. Going back to what Chris said about investment certainty, if you have rules that are on the books but unenforced, that does not create a healthy investment environment. No one really knows what that means. So they either are on the books or off the books, but they have to be enforced or taken off the books. Partnerships to improve measurements and develop technologies to reduce methane emissions in the natural gas value chain. A lot of what I will say confusion and uncertainty about how much methane is emitted from wellhead to burner tip. A lot of studies underway, including the EPA study right now. We need more certainty about that. We need better ways to measure. Going to the carbon recommendation, and I'm going to read this because I think it's really important that we understand it, is that as policymakers consider energy and environmental policies, they should recognize that the most effective and efficient method to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions would be a mechanism for putting a price on carbon. Emissions that is national, economy-wide, market-based, and part of an effective global framework. So again, this isn't a recommendation of the NPC. However, when we looked at the end-use technologies that could be applied to the reduction of greenhouse gases, the most cost-effective and efficient way to do this would be a price on carbon. And if we want to take a deeper dive, and if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions greater than 50%, we want to take that 80% reduction, again, if that's what policymakers would drive us towards doing, the only way to achieve that is with the carbon capture and sequestration technologies that right now are certainly being supported by the federal government with regard to coal, but this needs to be looked at with natural gas as well. It has to be a combined effort. Okay, so let's go into prudent development. We said this was the linchpin of the study, the most important aspect of it. What we have found throughout this study was prudent development came up over and over, because it was usually a yes, we can do that, but if not for all these environmental issues with regard to fracking and deep water drilling and the deep water spill, how will producers ever be able to reach this level of supply, high level of supply, as Andrew pointed out, with so much of a public outcry with regard and a lack of public confidence? And I'll say the outcry is not necessarily unjustified. It's a lack of public confidence. How do you gain the public's confidence? What stands in the way of having this license to operate? So first we had to take a look a little bit at the history and see where oil and natural gas had been drilled for in North America. And you can see that over 4.3 million wells have been drilled in North America. Over 1 million of those wells have been hydraulically fractured. So there's been a lot of work done. There's a lot of empirical evidence out there to support that this can be done prudently. But there have also been some incidents. So we have to recognize that, and we can't ignore it as an industry. So we looked at some of the technologies that exist, starting with just responsible surface use. One of the highlights that has created this increase in resource base has been the application of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. What you see here is an example of how we've gone from this vertical wellbore type of spacing pattern where you have 6 individual locations to where you have one single pad with 6 wells that are drilled from this pad, and they go horizontally, and you can see they affect the same area, same radius, same drainage radius as what the 6 pads, well pads, did previously. So the technology not only increased the resource base, but it reduced the surface footprint. This is a use of technology that actually benefits the landowners and the local communities because you can do so much from one pad. This is a specific example from the Marcellus Shale area. Another area where we've seen improvements in technologies are in closed-loop mud systems. On the left, you see an open-loop system where you have the big reserve pit. For those of you who are not familiar with drilling operations or the operation of pointers. Oh, wow. Okay, that's such a bright screen. But the reserve pit over here, this is huge. Many football fields worth of reserve pit for your mud system, which if you have a leak in your liner, you could actually contaminate groundwater. You could cause long-term surface damage, and that's going to be a scar for a long time. For many of you who have flown over West Texas all of your life, like I have, every time you look down and you see all those well pads and scars from the reserve pits, you know what I'm talking about. But what we can do now is we use closed-loop systems where we don't have to have reserve pits. We reuse the water, the fluids, take it from location to location, and we take the cuttings, and instead of putting them in a reserve pit, we actually take them to an authorized and licensed landfill so that they won't contaminate surface water and it won't be a problem long term. So again, another technology, advanced technology used by oil and gas operators to reduce surface impact. Groundwater protection is probably one of the biggest issues that we hear about as an industry, and probably one of the key issues that Chris heard about in his Secretary Energy Advisory Board sessions. How do we protect this precious resource, our groundwater? And we do it obviously with encasing our wellbores with steel and cement, But we have to make sure that the technologies, the cement is sufficient, that we actually do integrity test, and it involves baseline testing of the groundwater before we ever drill the well. We have to understand what that water looked like in the first place. We have to test before, we have to test during, we have to test after. That's not really high-tech stuff. That's just common sense. You have to know what has happened to the groundwater around you. We make sure that when we drill through these groundwater intervals, we're using freshwater muds or we're using air so as not to contaminate the groundwater when the drill pit is going through it before the casing and the cement ever hit the hole. So it's really important. It's one of the biggest issues with regard to local communities. Don't contaminate our groundwater. We certainly need to understand that and respect it. I think everyone in here can understand why. One way that we use technology, or another way we use technology to look at how that groundwater is protected, is the use of microseismic. And there are numerous graphs available. This one happens to be for the Barnett, but you'll see them for the Woodford, you'll see them for the Eagleford, you'll see them for the Niobrara that look very similar to this. But what you're using is microseismic technology where you're putting receptors in various well bores around the well that's being fracked to see how big the fracture height is when you go through the operation, when you go through the fracture operation. You can see the blue at the top of this graph represents the deepest depth of groundwater. Okay, so from surface to your deepest groundwater interval. And then you see the frac occurring down at various intervals across the field. This again happens to be in the Barnett. But never does that frac height grow to a taller height, if you will, to reach the bottom of your deepest freshwater intervals. This is a way to use technology to show the local communities and the landowners what's going on within the wellbore so that they don't have to have that concern that you're contaminating their groundwater with your fracture operations. This is also very important to the geologists and the engineers who design the fracture operation because, quite frankly, they don't want these frac heights to grow much larger than the zone of interest. That's wasted energy, it's wasted water, it's wasted sand, and wasted horsepower. That all costs money. So to have a huge frac height does you no good. You get out of the interval of interest, and who cares? But again, it's this particular piece can be used to help landowners understand better whether or not a fracture would affect their groundwater. Okay, touch on regulation. Chris touched on this earlier. He says it's very complex. It is. Each state, and there are 32 producing states, each state that has production operations and their boundaries, has state regulations that govern oil and gas activity. There are also federal regulations that come from the EPA, among others, in certain cases where you have the BLM that's involved. But there are regulations, abundant regulations, that govern activities all the way from leasing and seismic activity to the very end of the well when you get into the plug and abandonment and restoration phases of the well. Those regulations exist across these many states. Now you might say, okay, there are 32 producing states. Is it really possible to have any kind of consistency? Some states must be better than others. Yes, that is true. Some states are better than others, but fortunately for all states and for us as an industry, there is some similarity because there are organizations like the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission that is an assembly of state regulators from all 32 producing states that talk about consistent regulation and good regulation versus bad regulation. They have sample regulations for states that are just getting into the business of oil and gas production within their boundaries: New Jersey, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania. That it seems kind of odd since they were involved in the first oil well in the United States, but all the shale gas activity has really overburdened them with the amount of work that they have to do. So they pick up and they glean different regulatory expertise from other regulators in states, and they can share across boundaries. You also see a group called Stronger, which goes in and does assessments of states. They have to be invited, but they can assess the state's regulatory parameters and give them a report card, if you will, based on what they see in terms of best practices on the regulatory side. So there are differences because states govern this activity and regulate this activity. However, there are more similarities than you might think. Also, there's a good argument for states having this regulatory jurisdiction and oversight because they're the closest to it. Federal government is further removed. You have people that have boots on the ground, they're community members. They are right there amongst all of the activity. Last thing I'll talk about is just environmental footprints. Large disparity in the type of work that you see with regard to environmental footprints. This is just two examples of water consumption and land disturbances for natural gas, coal, and wind. Obviously, on the water consumption side, natural gas is less impactful than coal, but more impactful than wind, and I think we would all expect that. But you see two different surveys here, one in blue and one in green, one from the Bonneville Power Administration and the green from the Environmental Cost of Energy Study. Same thing holds true with land disturbance. You see a trend, but you see vast differences in the outcomes, and this is because of the different broad and different assumptions out there. Policymakers have a hard time distinguishing between these types of surveys because you have so many different groups that present to them. The government needs a more consistent way of framing and looking at these types of footprint analyses because they're quite helpful. It's very helpful to you when you make decisions and policy and make policy. However, there needs to be more consistency with regard to the assumptions. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to touch on, and I'll be very brief, and that has to do with the recommendations in this section. And I think I've touched on many of them, but probably the most controversial and energetic recommendations that came from the study had to do with the councils of excellence. We made this recommendation, and there were many who supported it, a few who did not support it. But essentially what we recommended was that we would have regional councils of excellence that were responsible for gathering the best practices in a certain region. And we're starting with the Marcellus area. I can probably speak more on that in the Q&A session. But we recommended that we start in the Marcellus area of operation in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, simply because there's just so much energy there, not only natural gas energy, but energy with regard to fracking and drilling operations and public concern over these types of operations. So we felt like it was important to establish regional councils of excellence that could address best practices with regard to environmental performance, disseminate that to not only operators within the area, but the regulators as well. Because the technologies exist at the operating level because there's a commercial incentive to do well and perform well. Regulators don't have the same expertise, they don't have the same resources. So to be able to disseminate those best practices in real time from these regional councils of excellence is extremely important to raise that regulatory bar continuously. And if you raise that regulatory bar continuously, then you increase everyone's performance, not just those that are on the upper end of technology and the upper end of performance, but everyone in the area. So that was, again, one of the key recommendations. There was some controversy around it. However, we have followed through with it, and there's actually been a Marcellus Regional Council of Excellence that has started, and there'll be more on that in a press release probably this week. So I'm going to wrap up and just say, reiterate what we stated earlier, and that's that we have enormous oil and gas resources in North America. And again, reminding everyone there's enough supply to support our national objectives, including our environmental, economic, and energy security interest. The linchpin to all of this and the key is excellent operational performance and prudent development. So I will close right now, and Ken, I'll turn the floor back to you. I know you wanted to moderate the session, and we'll line up for Q&A.
Chris, you guys to come up to the table. Okay, so first I want to thank you all for your time and efforts. Sounds like a fantastic study. I actually participated to some extent in various aspects of it, but I haven't seen the finished product yet, so it's nice to see the presentation. And with that, I'll open it up to the floor for questions. If you have any questions, by all means, fire away. Yes?
What's prudent development?
That's a great question, and it was one that we struggled with and actually defined in the report. When we looked at prudent development, it was being able to operate effectively and efficiently and keep pace with not only the supply and demand aspects of oil and gas, but also making sure that we were maintaining a good level of communication with the community, that there was local support, that we weren't doing things that were imprudent, if you will, with regard to the environment. Trying to balance our environmental protection with economic security, with energy security, and with economic prosperity. So it's trying to balance those three areas. And so I would really say that when you talk about prudent development, what it equates to is it's a balance of those three areas.
I would just give an example. I think that someone in suburban New York City would have what they would consider prudent development is quite a bit different than someone in South Texas might consider prudent development. It's an awfully big envelope, it seems to me, that you're using.
It's a huge envelope, and I think that's why it's so important, and how we arrived at the conclusion that the councils of excellence were so important in these various areas of operation, because you're quite right. There are the geographic differences as well as the geologic differences as well as just the community differences from area to area. West Texas, residents of West Texas are going to have a different level of support or non-support than people in, say, upstate New York. And those differences require these regional councils of excellence to define what best practices would be in those areas and to try and come up with a one-size-fits-all definition of prudent development and what the proper balance would be in upstate New York versus West Texas. It's going to be completely different, and so therefore you have to go in and define that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Interested from the panel to hear, say in the year 2020, the whole LNG export potential, is there going to be material volumes exported?
We took a look at that, and clearly it's something we had to build into our high-level demand cases. I think we built it up to a potential of about 5 BCF a day over the next 15 to 20 years. What you have to realize is that even on an existing brownfield site, the capital intensity of a liquefaction facility is still quite high. You're talking a couple of $1 billion or more. And so the number of entities which could do this development is relatively limited. And so we don't see wholesale LNG liquefaction facilities in the same way as that you saw wholesale regasification facilities 5 to 8 years ago. The capital intensity of liquefaction is an order of magnitude higher than for regasification. So it's limited by the capital exposure. There will be some, I believe.
Yes.
One of the differences between the optimistic, bright and shiny NPC future from before and the next one that was we need LNG as quickly as possible was the decline rates in the existing natural gas wells were found to be much more faster declining than I guess the industry had participated. And I'm not an engineer. But when you did the study for the future of natural gas, from shale gas especially, is there very strong certainty about the decline rates out of the next 20 years for these horizontally fractured wells? Is there real certainty there that they're going to last 20 years?
We have data from early shale gas wells which goes back quite a long way, and so we've got more certainty than people generally think. I remember exactly the issue you talk about when we were talking about when the industry was dominated by conventional gas drilling, and you were looking at 27 to 30% average annual decline rates per year on a well basis. With unconventional wells, basically what you get is high first to second year decline and then a tail, which goes on for quite a long time. We've got evidence that that tail does exist, because the oldest shale gas wells, even though there are not many of them, are going back a decade or more. The other point I would make is that if you frame the context wider than the well analysis and you look at basin analysis, basins are growing in supply, whether they're from the Barnett Shale, which is the kind of the first area we played in, to the more recent one, the Marcellus. They still growing. The only reason that at basin level you flatten out is because activity moves elsewhere, because there are more economic activities. So the Barnett is flattening out right now in terms of the data. It's not because of well performance, it's because people are moving their rigs and they're drilling to other places.
I might also add to that a couple things. First of all, what we have seen from an engineering perspective is that the ultimate recovery of these wells, the expected ultimate recovery of these wells, are increasing over time with different applications of technology. So as we get better with our horizontal drilling and staying within the zone, as well as our zonal isolation and our stimulation technologies, we're actually seeing increases. And you can see these increases with type curves that allow you to look at what that expected ultimate recovery will be from the wells. Another thing that we have found is that we're in the areas of operation, such as the Marcellus, we have multiple horizons. So it's not just the Marcellus. You also get into the Utica Shale, which is below the Marcellus in the Pennsylvania area. That doesn't even show up in those resource estimates. So my expectation is you'll actually see increases, not decreases on this. Again, because the curves are getting better with technology, and because we're not really counting those additional horizons that will actually be targets in the future.
So the study focused on North American supply development, which is greatly influenced by regulatory and environmental policy. So to what degree did you look at differences in policy choices being made by the Canadians versus the Americans, and how that will guide the path of development potential?
Quite honestly, on the Canadian front, because we have this report is written for the Department of Energy. So to try to speak to Canada about their own policies would be a futile task. We did not spend a great deal of time on what those policies are or will be in Canada. Our policy recommendations centered around the U.S. So yes, it was a North American study. The policy recommendations were made for the United States.
However, I'd give two clarifications for that. When we looked at oil sands development in Alberta, we came up with a range which partially depended on pace of development driven by the type of regulation that was in place in Alberta and Western Canada. So that's built in the range you saw on that chart. When you look at Arctic development, we saw advantages in the Canadian regulatory system for leasing that, if applied to the U.S. Arctic, would be beneficial to Arctic development on the U.S. side of the border. So we looked at lessons or best practices in terms of leasing regulation in Arctic drilling.
Yeah, you try to avoid the problem that you had earlier, whether we are going to import or export LNG. But now the problem is like this. We have two such different scenarios. Production going down, and taking the case of natural gas, or going up by a considerable margin. Now when you go to the next study that you are talking about, the transportation fuel, which scenario will you take? Or what are the factors which will affect either having less production or more production? And if somebody has to make some decision like what exactly, not exactly, but what are some of the things which can change? Because it's such a vast difference in terms of your production forecast.
Yes, I think on the natural gas side particularly, we were looking at the degree of regulatory oversight of hydraulic fracturing, in particular, and unconventional gas development. Now, that is such an important part of those supply curves that if you would take off a significant part of that, then you're very quickly in a world where natural gas production has a hard time to grow. And so we need to look very hard at what regulatory signals are coming through in terms of things like hydraulic fracturing, water protection, and those kinds of things, because it's such a crucial part of the supply curve. On the demand side, we kind of built in a notional allowance of how much natural gas would penetrate transportation, but really the detail of how that happens and what is the real scope is going to come through in the transportation fuel study, because that's about engine development, fueling infrastructure development, and consumer choice, which are a little bit outside our scope.
Can I just a clarifying question, because I think this is what you were getting. How do you ensure, will the MPC ensure that the studies are not mutually exclusive in terms of the set of recommendations they bring forward? Will there be some conversation, in other words, to make sure the recommendations are consistent?
Yes, absolutely. There has been integration throughout, Ken, and I didn't quite pick that up from your question, but there are two studies, and let's make sure that we have that clearly on the table. The study, the Prudent Development Report that had to do with North American resource development, and then the future transportation fuel study that is being led by Marathon presently. And so that's underway. The results of that study will come out probably mid-year of 2012. So we're just a few months away from seeing what those results will be. But we have integrated throughout the supply. Andrew and his team have provided supply information to that transportation group because they're looking at a multitude of different options to include natural gas vehicles or electric vehicles, which could be and probably would be powered by natural gas generated electricity. So we have to integrate quite closely with them, and I actually sit on their coordinating subcommittee as well.
Your slides, anyway, have a few references to EOR, and then, of course, greenhouse gas emissions and carbon, price of carbon. Does the study take a position on converting the CO2 pipeline system to a FERC-regulated more along the natural gas pipeline system, or leaving it more like the liquids pipelines, and the impact of leaving it as opposed to making the infrastructure easier to build out?
We didn't look specifically at CO2 pipeline development, and the reason for that was because we looked at the CO2 for EOR opportunity as a whole from an upstream basis. What can it add to those upside wedges? And you need economic CO2 supplies. And clearly there are wedges involved. You have the wedge of naturally occurring CO2, which comes from West Texas. Then you have a wedge of economic CO2, which comes from things like pulp and paper plants and natural gas processing plants, which can economically come through the system. That doesn't actually open you up a whole lot more EOR opportunities. It kind of more flattens the curve. Going beyond that, you're talking about anthropogenic CO2, so capture from industry and power plants. The economic model for that doesn't exist. It would be totally dependent on government policy. Basically, we could not see a pathway to even building that into our upside case within this study. So the pipeline issue specifically that you mentioned, I think would be contingent on that third wedge. And I think that will play out over 20 years to come, but right now it's not clear enough how that will play out.
In your study, did you look at the impact on drilling and other services that need to be provided to produce the types of results 10, 20 years out, as well as looking at the environmental impact? So did you home in on that?
We if you read the resource and supply chapter, particularly related to natural gas, you'll find a supply chain analysis where we looked at rigs, we looked at water, we looked at proppant, we looked at steel supply chains, and basically tracked, using today's benchmarks, track the requirements for the type of growth we're looking at that I showed on these slides here. And there are ramp-ups in all those areas, but they look manageable given the pace of the ramp-up and given the type of activity we've seen historically. The number of rigs, for example, is far below the peak rig deployment in the 1980s. That's because we're using far more efficient rigs these days, and many more wells per year get drilled today than they did 10 or 15 years ago. So yes, it's an important question, and we looked at it particularly in the onshore arena where the intensity of activity is the greatest.
And if we could on this, I was going to ask Chris Conoscenti, if you would speak a little bit to this, at least on the manpower study work that you all had done with regard to having that training and the math and sciences and the degreed professionals that could help out, not only on the oil and gas operation side, but on the infrastructure side, and then in the regulatory world as well.
Sure. So we obviously looked at a lot of topics as part of the macroeconomic analysis, but the only area that actually bubbled up to a recommendation from the study was on the workforce. And the clear issue there is the wave of baby boomers retiring as technical professionals, and then the replacement cycle of getting new hires in with far less working experience to replace them. There used to be about a dozen training centers that were run by the majors. Now there's one left. And so there's been consolidation in the form of M&A. There's been a lot of factors have led to the situation we're in today. So it's going to take a lot of work on the part of the private sector and some help from the public sector to change the direction that some of these people take in school and change and maybe influence the way people are trained and are capable of performing some of these tasks once they're out there working.
Yes, coal plants are baseload plants, power plants, and natural gas plants, combined cycles, are usually used for peak shaving, shorter term. Now, in order to balance a grid, you need baseload plants, but if you're replacing coal plants with natural gas plants, you're going to run into a problem. How does the study address that problem?
Yeah, typically, the absolute peakers for peak demand are single cycle combustion turbines for natural gas. Combined cycle are more load responsive, so you can actually ramp them up and down much faster than a coal plant and respond across the dispatch curve. The reason that combined cycles are not running at base load in many regions right now is because basically there was an overbuild in the beginning of this decade, and so the capacity utilizations are quite low. So they're being used for mid-merit and peaking, but they have the capability of more baseload operations in combined cycle.
The problem you have is balancing your grids, and with natural gas plants you're going to have shutdowns several times a year, making it, particularly if you have a high concentration, making it very, very difficult for anybody to balance a grid.
Well, natural gas is a natural complement to intermittent generation because wind power, for example, peak wind supply load is at night, peak demand is the day. So if you've got a big component of wind generation, it's a natural complement to have gas-fired generation, which can ramp up and down to balance that load. As renewables get to be a bigger part of the generation mix, that strategic role for natural gas becomes more important. And it's about every supply region, every utility region has a reserve margin, a reserve factor, and it's built into capacity planning.
I might add on that, this was a big topic of the study. We, as part of our coordinating subcommittee, we had Philip Moeller, who is one of the FERC commissioners, and he had a great deal of interest in this, and probably one of the key reasons that he actually participated in the study. Great deal of concern of how you will balance those grids. So what you're saying is spot on. It's part of the recommendation for harmonizing the markets between the power markets and the natural gas markets, because not only is it difficult to balance the grids, the scheduling of natural gas and power are completely different. Mm-hmm. And as long as they're different, you cannot balance the two. So they have to come up with ways to deal with day-ahead scheduling versus real-time scheduling for the power markets, how that will be dealt with, and what kind of rules will be enforced. So the FERC is very much engaged in this. It was part of the recommendation, part of the ongoing efforts of the FERC as they try to meet this challenge. You throw into that mix the increased renewables, which also make for interesting occurrences within the grid. When the sun quits shining on a cloudy day or the wind quits blowing, then that creates its own hardships, and it creates some balancing that, again, was not scheduled into the day-ahead scheduling of the natural gas pipelines. So This is something that will have to be addressed, and it will have to be balanced. It doesn't fix itself.
And it hasn't been fixed yet. They haven't come up with a solution.
You're right.
So I'd like to address Chris Smith about the competition for ideas and policy within the federal government. And this particular, I think it is well known to everybody that different federal agencies have different opinions about things and they'd like to do different things. And some of us in the industry in Houston wonder whether they even talk to each other. I would like to point out one of the things that you all here advocate so much as this regional centers of excellence, which I personally think is a good idea, but I compare that with statements from the Interior and EPA, which are rather anathema to the idea. So I'd like to hear about how ideas are being sold within the government itself and where the discussions are, and especially at the policy level.
Yeah, that's actually, it's a really good question. So as this study was being created, this is obviously a federal advisory committee that advises the Secretary of Energy, and we've got a particular piece of the equation which is around development of technology and making recommendations for utilization of resources. So we've got a broad role in terms of policy, but a relatively specific role in terms of development of technology. And as we talked within DOE about how we phrase the study, what we asked NPC to do, because this is a very prominent federal advisory committee, all the CEOs sit on this FACA, on this federal advisory committee. There candidly was some discussion of, well, what if the NPC comes back with a recommendation that we don't like, right? Obviously these are independent thinkers, and they're going to be looking at the equation and coming up with their own ideas. And Secretary Chu is very clear around, listen, we want the best of the ideas. We're not going to agree with everything that they say, but we want the best thinkers coming forth and helping us to get a different view on the equation that we might get from some different areas. Generally, a lot of the recommendations I think are really positive. A lot of them are aligned with recommendations we've gotten from other groups. There's some that we like less, but such is life. I think we've gotten a good opinion here. In terms of how all the agencies work together, you would observe probably maybe the difference of focus between DOE and EPA. I think is the thing that becomes most obvious. I know that when I came into this role a couple years ago, when I first came in, we'd have companies come and visit us, and as soon as they're in the seat, the first thing they want to talk about is EPA. They don't want to talk about DOE. They don't want to talk about what the guys over at EPA are doing. And I think that over the course of time, you've created this history where you have a tendency for industry to come talk to DOE, NGOs, environmentalists come to EPA, and then the two agencies would have the potential to behave as proxies for these outside forces, which are their constituencies. That's probably a bad way to make policy. It creates a lot of confusion. It's the natural way of things if you don't make sure that doesn't happen. So you'll see going forward a few specific steps that we're going to take. One is to have an open and explicit and transparent process by which EPA and USGS within DOI and DOE come together to create a single approach towards doing research and development that's geared towards quantifying the risks and the uncertainties that have to deal with producing unconventional oil and gas and looking at the deep water offshore. So we're going to make some very specific steps to bring those three agencies together so that you get one view. Those three agencies have different competencies, they have different research capabilities, they have different viewpoints to a certain degree. But we certainly all have a single objective, which is with oil and gas resources, the long-term prudent development, which means that you gain the confidence of the communities, that you make good decisions based on risks that you've quantified using good science, and that you have a set of regulatory steps and rules and regulations both at the state level and at the federal level, which actually mitigate risks that you've scientifically quantified. So that's a big mandate, right? Because a lot of these issues become emotional, as you would expect them to be. I mean, we're developing these resources where people live, right? We're developing them in their communities, and so we're working hand in hand with EPA, and we're working hand in hand with DOI to ensure that things that happen at the federal level which you can do on federal lands when it comes to developing oil and gas resources that are on federal lands, and rules that happen at the federal level that fall under EPA's jurisdiction are consistent with the research that we're doing and things that are happening at the state level. So that's a work in progress. It's a problem that we acknowledge that we have to deal with, but one that we're going to be making some specific steps to hopefully do a little bit better.
Okay, I guess we're going to go ahead and suspend questions there. There is lunch that's going to be served immediately following this. Before we break, though, first thing I would like to do is give our participants a hand. Thank you. The other thing I'd like to do is thank the United States Association for Energy Economics. The Houston chapter actually helped co-sponsor this event along with the Baker Institute Energy Forum and the Department of Energy. Beyond that, lunch is served. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a good segue, right?